Beautiful, isn't it? The transport pilot's voice carried a hint of pride. The logical one spent 50 years building it. Not a single mistake was made during construction. Hai-Jin nodded but said nothing. As an engineer, she knew that perfect systems often had hidden problems. Things that worked in theory didn't always work in practice. But she kept that thought to herself. The docking procedure was exactly what she expected from the logical ones: precise, measured, and completely by the book. No variations, no adjustments, just pure mathematical perfection. The clamps engaged with a soft hiss, and the airlock cycled with exact timing. Engineer Park. A tall, gray-skinned figure waited at the dock. Its large, silvery eyes studied her with unsettling intensity. "I am Grand Observer Kale. Welcome to Celestial Harmony Station." Hai-Jin bowed slightly, remembering her diplomatic training. "Thank you for having me, Grand Observer. I look forward to working with your engineering team." "Yes, though I must admit we are uncertain about the necessity of human assistance." Kale's tone was neutral, but Hai-Jin caught the slight pause. "Our systems are perfect." The halls of the station were spotless, with every panel aligned to exact measurements. Hai-Jin followed Kale, listening to his detailed explanation of the station's various systems. Everything was organized by strict logical principles, every process optimized to theoretical perfection. They'd reached the main engineering bay, where several alien engineers worked at their stations. Each movement was precise, each action calculated. The room was silent except for the soft hum of machinery. "Your workspace." Kale gestured to a terminal. "Chief Engineer Voss will oversee your integration into our systems." A shorter alien stepped forward, their silver eyes narrowed slightly. "Engineer Park, I have reviewed your credentials. Your methods are unusual. I get results," Hai-Jin said simply, setting down her toolkit. "Through trial and error." Voss made it sound like a disease, a most inefficient approach. Before Hai-Jin could respond, an alarm blared through the engineering bay. Red lights flashed as one of the status displays turned crimson. "Cooling system malfunction in Section 7, announced a calm voice. "Deviation from optimal parameters detected." The alien engineers froze for a moment, their fingers flying over displays as they ran calculations. Voss stepped forward, speaking in their native language as multiple screens filled with complex equations. Hai-Jin glanced at the readouts. The problem was simple: a stuck valve in the coolant system. But the aliens were already deep into complex mathematical models, calculating every possible variable. Without a word, she grabbed her tools and headed for the access tunnel. "Engineer Park." Voss called after her. "We have not yet determined the optimal solution." "Sometimes you don't need optimal," she called back. "Sometimes you just need it fixed." She reached the valve as the aliens were still running their calculations. The problem was obvious. Mineral buildup had jammed the mechanism. Standard issue on any long-running system, no matter how perfect the design. Hai-Jin pulled out a wrench and gave the valve housing 3 sharp taps in specific spots. The mechanism shuddered, then freed itself with a click. The coolant flow returned to normal immediately. When she returned to the engineering bay, she found every alien staring at her in what could only be described as horror. "You hit it." Voss's voice trembled slightly. "With a primitive tool." "It worked," Hai-Jin said with a shrug. "But there was no calculation, no analysis. You could not have known the exact force required or the precise points of impact." "I didn't. I used experience and common sense. Sometimes that's all you need." The aliens exchanged looks of pure distress. Grand Observer Kale stepped forward, their tall frame rigid with concern. "Engineer Park," they said carefully, "while we appreciate your assistance, I must ask that you follow proper protocols in the future. All actions on this station must be based on complete logical analysis." Hai-Jin nodded politely, but she knew this was just the beginning. The aliens would learn that not everything in the universe followed their perfect logical rules. Sometimes you had to try things and see what worked. As she organized her workspace, she could still feel their disturbed gazes on her back. To them, her actions were nothing short of horror. The idea that someone would act without complete mathematical certainty, that they would solve problems through trial and error rather than pure logic. She smiled slightly. This assignment was going to be very interesting indeed. 3 days after the valve incident, Do-young Kim arrived at the station. Unlike Hai-jin's quiet entrance, his arrival caused quite a stir among the logical ones. As a systems analyst, his very job was to find flaws, something the aliens insisted couldn't exist in their perfect station. "They really don't like us being here, do they?" Do-young whispered to Hai-jin as they sat in the station's eating area. The aliens at nearby tables kept stealing glances at them, their silver eyes reflecting the bright overhead lights. "They think we're dangerous," Hai-jin replied, picking at her food. "Yesterday, I saw one of them run a 10-minute calculation on the best way to drink water." Do-young laughed, then quickly covered his mouth when several aliens turned to stare. Spontaneous expressions of emotion were another thing that bothered them. "I need to show you something," he said quietly, sliding a datapad across the table. "I've been reviewing their system logs." Hai-jin looked at the screen and frowned. The numbers showed tiny variations in power consumption across multiple systems. Each change was small, but the pattern was clear. Something wasn't working as perfectly as the aliens believed. "Have you told them?" she asked. "Tried to. Chief Engineer Voss said my analysis must be flawed because their systems are perfect." Do-young shook his head. "They won't even look at the data." Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement. "All engineering staff report to main control. Routine perfection verification in progress." Hai-jin and Do-young found the control room packed with alien engineers. Grand Observer Kale stood at the front, presenting a series of complex equations that supposedly proved the station's flawless operation. "As you can see," Kale was saying, "every calculation confirms the absolute perfection of our systems. There can be no possibility of error." Do-young raised his hand. The aliens all turned to stare at him, their movements perfectly synchronized. "Yes, Analyst Kim." Kale's voice held a hint of annoyance. "I found some inconsistencies in the power usage patterns," Do-young said, holding up his datapad. "Small variations that could indicate." "Impossible," Voss cut in. "Our systems are perfect. Your measuring methods must be flawed." "But the numbers are wrong," Kale said firmly. "Perhaps human instruments are not precise enough to understand our technology." Hai-jin watched Do-young's face fall. She knew that feeling. The frustration of being dismissed simply because they were human, because they didn't trust in perfect logic above all else. After the meeting, they walked through the station's curved corridors together. The walls hummed softly, a sound that seemed slightly different from 3 days ago, though Hai-jin was sure the aliens would deny any change. "They're going to have a real problem soon," Do-young said, showing her more data. "These variations are getting bigger. Slowly, but steadily." "They won't believe it until something breaks," Hai-jin replied. "And maybe not even then." They passed a group of young alien engineers who were running a simulation. The aliens' fingers moved in perfect patterns across their screens, each movement calculated to mathematical precision. But Hai-jin noticed something. Tiny hesitations, almost invisible moments of doubt. "Look," she whispered to Do-young. "They're starting to question things. They just don't know it yet." One of the young engineers looked up and caught them watching. Instead of turning away, the alien held their gaze for a moment. Then, very quietly, they asked, "How do you know when to try something different?" The other aliens gasped. Asking such a question was clearly shocking to them. But before Hai-jin could answer, Chief Engineer Voss appeared around the corner. "Return to your calculations," Voss ordered the young engineers. "And remember, perfect logic is the only path to truth." As they walked away, Do-young turned to Hai-jin. "They're scared of us. Not because we might break something, but because we might be right. Perfect logic is comfortable, Hai-Jin said. It tells you exactly what to do, exactly what to think. But the universe isn't perfect. Sometimes you need to try new things, make mistakes, learn from them. To them, that's horror, Du-young replied. Pure chaos. They reached their quarters, but before they parted, Hai-Jin added, keep tracking those power variations. Something tells me we're going to need that data soon. As she prepared for sleep, Hai-Jin thought about the young engineer's question. Change was coming to the station, whether the logical ones wanted it or not. The only question was whether they would learn to adapt, or if their perfect logic would be their downfall. The first big problem happened during the night cycle. Hai-Jin woke to flashing red lights and a computer voice announcing, gravity fluctuation detected in Section 12. Parameters outside acceptable range. She pulled on her work suit and grabbed her toolkit. In the corridor, she met Du-young, who was already checking his datapad. It's getting worse, he said as they hurried toward Section 12. The power variations I spotted last week, they're causing the gravity plates to malfunction. They found Section 12 in chaos, by alien standards. The logical ones floated slightly above the floor, their movements precisely calculated despite the failing gravity. Chief Engineer Voss stood with 3 other aliens, all staring at floating screens filled with equations. The calculations indicate this is impossible, one alien was saying. The gravity systems are perfect. Clearly not, Hai-Jin said, pushing off a wall to float toward them. The aliens watched in horror as she moved without calculating her trajectory first. We must find the exact mathematical solution, Voss insisted. Random actions will only make things worse. Just then, Jai-Ho Lee, the human diplomatic liaison, floated into the section. Unlike Hai-Jin's controlled movements, he spun slowly, looking slightly green. The council demands answers, Jai-Ho said, grabbing a handrail to stop his rotation. 3 other sections are reporting similar problems. Hai-Jin looked at Du-young. Show them your data. Now. Du-young pulled up his power variation charts. The system's been showing signs of instability for weeks. Small changes at first, but they're growing. The gravity problems are just the first visible sign. The aliens studied the charts in silence. Hai-Jin could almost see their logical minds struggling with this evidence of imperfection. Perhaps, one young engineer said hesitantly, perhaps we should try adjusting the power flow. Without a complete mathematical model, Voss sounded scandalized. Impossible. We must calculate every possible outcome first. How long will that take? Hai-Jin asked. Approximately 72 hours. The gravity will fail completely in less than 10, Du-young said, checking his readings. Hai-Jin had heard enough. She pushed off toward the main power control panel. I'm going to try something. Stop her, Voss ordered. But in the low gravity, the aliens' perfectly calculated movements were too slow. Hai-Jin reached the panel and opened her toolkit. She pulled out a diagnostic scanner, human-made, considered primitive by alien standards. Its screen showed power surges moving through the system like waves. Du-young, can you reroute power from Section 15? It's empty right now. He nodded and started typing on his pad. The aliens watched in what looked like physical pain as the humans made quick, intuitive adjustments to their perfect system. This is unauthorized, Voss protested. You cannot simply. The gravity suddenly stabilized. Everyone dropped a few centimeters to the floor with a soft thud. How did you know that would work? The young engineer asked, their silver eyes wide with curiosity. We didn't, Hai-Jin admitted. But we saw a problem and tried a solution. When you're dealing with complex systems, sometimes you have to experiment. Experiment. Several aliens shuddered at the word. Jai-Ho stepped forward, ever the diplomat. What Engineer Park means is that there are different approaches to problem solving. Some require quick action based on experience. But it's not logical, Voss insisted. You had no proof it would work. No, Du Yum agreed. But we had evidence of the problem and a reasonable solution to try. And because we tried, we learned something new about the system. The young engineer who had spoken earlier moved closer to the power panel, studying Hai-Jin's diagnostic screen with interest. The power flow. It's not perfect, but it's stable now. How fascinating. This is dangerous thinking, Voss warned. Perfect logic has served us for generations. But Hai-Jin noticed that several other young aliens were now gathering around Du Young, watching as he explained his power variation data. Their perfect logical world was showing cracks, and through those cracks, curiosity was beginning to shine. The gravity issue is just the beginning, Du Young told them quietly. These power fluctuations are affecting other systems too. We need to find the root cause. And we'll need to try different solutions, Hai-Jin added. Some won't work. That's okay. Each failure teaches us something new. The aliens looked troubled by this idea, but they didn't move away. Progress, Hai-Jin thought. Small steps toward understanding that perfection wasn't always the answer. As if to emphasize her thought, another alarm started blaring in the distance. 3 hours after the gravity incident, things got much worse. Alarms rang through every section of the station. Red warning lights flashed everywhere, making the silver walls look like they were bleeding. Primary cooling system failing in sections 3 through 7, the computer announced. Secondary systems showing critical stress. Power grid unstable. Life support operating at 70% efficiency. In the main control room, Hai-Jin and Du Young watched as more and more warning lights turned on. The alien engineers worked at their stations, their movements becoming less precise as panic, an emotion they had never planned for, began to set in. The equations aren't working, one alien cried out. Every solution fails before we can implement it. Grand Observer Kale stood in the center of the room, their tall frame rigid with stress. Continue the calculations. There must be a perfect solution. There isn't time, Du Young said, checking his datapad. The power fluctuations are getting worse. They're affecting every system now. Hai-Jin pointed to a display showing the station's power grid. Look at that pattern. It's like waves in a pond, each problem causing new problems. The young alien engineer who had shown interest in human methods earlier, they had learned their name was Tren, moved closer to study the display. The pattern. It's beautiful in a terrifying way. Focus on your calculations, Voss snapped. But even the chief engineer's voice held a note of uncertainty now. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The artificial gravity wobbled, making everyone stumble. The computer's voice became distorted as it announced, "Warning, main reactor showing signs of instability. If the reactor goes, we all die," Du Young said quietly. Jai-Ho, who had been trying to calm the increasingly anxious alien council members, rushed over. The council is demanding answers. They're talking about evacuating the station. Evacuation is failure, Kale declared. We must find the perfect solution. Hai-Jin had heard enough. She grabbed her toolkit and headed for the door. Du Young, come with me. Tren, we could use your help too. Where are you going? Voss demanded. To try something that probably won't work, Hai-Jin called back. And then we'll try something else. And we'll keep trying until we find what does work. To everyone's surprise, Tren followed them. 3 other young alien engineers hesitated, then hurried after them too. This is unacceptable, Voss shouted. Return to your stations immediately. But another power surge rocked the station, and in the chaos, no one stopped them from leaving. In the corridor, Hai-Jin turned to her small team. Du Young, what's your best guess about the root cause? The power fluctuation started near the main reactor's control systems, he said, showing them his data. But the pattern's strange. It's like the power is fighting against the control protocols. The protocols are perfect, one of the young aliens said, then added quietly, at least, they're supposed to be. Nothing's perfect, Hai-Jin said as they rushed through the corridors. And that's okay. Perfect things can't adapt. They can't grow. They can't learn. They reached the reactor control room. Through the reinforced windows, they could see the reactor's core pulsing with an unsteady light. The control panels were covered in warning messages. The protocols are trying to force the reactor to maintain exact power levels, Tren observed, looking at the readings. But the power output keeps changing naturally. The system won't adapt, Du Young said. It's fighting against normal variations instead of working with them. Another surge rocked the station. The lights went out completely for 3 seconds before emergency power kicked in. We need to try something, Hai Jin said. Tren, you know these systems better than we do. What would happen if we disabled some of the control protocols? The alien engineers looked horrified. Disable the protocols. But they're perfect. They're what keep us safe. Are they keeping us safe right now? Hai Jin asked softly. The aliens looked at each other. Years of perfect logical training warred with the evidence in front of them. Through the window, the reactor's pulses were becoming more erratic. Finally, Tren stepped forward. I have an idea. It's not perfect. It might not work, but maybe we could try it. For the first time since arriving on the station, Hai Jin saw real hope. The aliens were beginning to understand. Sometimes, you had to let go of perfection to find the right answer. Tell us your idea, she said, and let's get ready to try Plan B when it fails. Behind them, more alarms began to sound. Tren's hands shook as they worked at the control panel. The other young aliens watched with a mixture of fear and fascination as their colleague did something none of them had ever dared before, trying an unproven solution. The protocols are too rigid, Tren explained, pointing to the reactor's power curve. They try to force the reactor to maintain exact power levels. But what if we let it breathe a little? Like a living thing, Hai Jin said, nodding. Everything natural has rhythms and cycles. Fighting against them takes more energy than working with them. Do Young studied his datapad. The power fluctuations started right after the last protocol update. The system's trying to be too perfect. A loud bang echoed through the station, followed by more alarms. The computer's voice crackled. Warning. Life support now at 50% capacity. Main reactor approaching critical parameters. We need to decide now, Hai Jin said. Tren, what exactly do you want to try? I think we should disable the secondary and tertiary control protocols, Tren said. Keep the primary safety systems, but let the reactor find its own balance. The other young aliens gasped. One of them, named Leth, stepped forward. But those protocols took years to perfect. The calculations aren't working. Du Young cut in gently. Sometimes we need to trust what we see over what we calculated. Before anyone could argue further, Grand Observer Kale and Chief Engineer Voss burst into the control room, followed by several senior engineers. Step away from the controls, Voss ordered. This unauthorized experimentation must stop. But Hai Jin saw something in Kale's silver eyes. Doubt. The Grand Observer had seen too many perfect solutions fail today. Grand Observer, she said, your station is dying. The protocols are killing it. We need to try something different. Try. Kale's voice wavered, without certainty of success. Another explosion rocked the station. Emergency lights flickered as more systems failed. Primary life support failing, the computer announced. Emergency systems engaging. Time to critical reactor failure, 15 minutes. Kale looked around the control room, at the failing systems, at their frightened crew. For the first time in their life, the Grand Observer faced a problem that perfect logic couldn't solve. Explain your plan, they said finally. Quickly, Tren outlined their idea. Hai Jin watched the other aliens' faces as they listened. Some looked horrified, but others, especially the younger ones, showed growing understanding. It's like medicine, Leth said suddenly. Sometimes healing means letting the body correct itself instead of forcing it to follow exact rules. Exactly. Du Young smiled. Systems need flexibility to handle real-world conditions. Kale turned to Voss. Chief Engineer, your assessment. Voss looked torn between horror and desperation. It's against everything we believe. But our beliefs aren't saving the station. Another surge hit, stronger than before. The reactor's pulsing became more erratic. 10 minutes to critical failure, the computer warned. Do it, Kale ordered. Tren's fingers flew over the controls, disabling the extra protocols. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the reactor's pulse changed, became slower, steadier. Power fluctuations decreasing, Du Young reported, watching his readings. The system's finding its natural rhythm. Life support stabilizing, the computer announced. Reactor parameters returning to safe levels. Everyone watched as the warning lights began turning off one by one. The reactor's glow became steady, its power output settling into a gentle wave pattern, instead of the rigid, straight line it had maintained before. It's dancing, one of the young aliens said in wonder. Not perfect, Hai-Jin said, but healthy. Sometimes that's better than perfect. Kale stepped closer to the window, watching the reactor's steady pulse. All our lives, we believed perfect logic was the answer to everything. But today we learned something new. That's the real perfection, Du Young said. Being able to learn and adapt. Tren looked at their hands, still shaking slightly. I was so scared to try. But it felt right. That feeling. Hai-Jin smiled. That's called intuition. Another useful tool for problem solving. The aliens looked thoughtful as they watched their reactor work in its new, imperfect way. Centuries of rigid thinking were beginning to crack, letting new ideas flow in. But in the corner, Voss stood watching with narrow eyes. Not everyone was ready to embrace change, Hai-Jin realized. Their troubles weren't over yet. 2 hours after the reactor crisis, the station buzzed with unusual energy. Aliens gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices about what had happened. Some looked excited, others terrified. The perfect order of their world had cracked, and through that crack, chaos and possibility had entered. In the main conference room, Grand Observer Kale called an emergency meeting. Hai-Jin, Du Young, and Tren stood before the council, facing rows of troubled silver eyes. What you did was unprecedented, one council member said. You acted without perfect knowledge of the outcome. And it worked, another added, sounding almost afraid of the idea. Chief Engineer Voss stood up. It was luck, nothing more. We cannot abandon generations of logical perfection because of one lucky guess. It wasn't luck, Du Young said quietly. He projected his data onto the main screen. Look at these patterns. The reactor is actually running better now than it did under perfect control. It's found its natural balance. The council members studied the data. Hai-Jin watched their faces, seeing the struggle between old beliefs and new evidence. But how can we trust solutions we haven't fully calculated? One asked. The horror of uncertainty. I was scared too, Tren said, surprising everyone. Young engineers rarely spoke in council meetings, but when I tried something new, when I saw it work, it felt like discovering a new color or hearing music for the first time. Just then, another alarm sounded. The computer's voice echoed through the room. Warning. Environmental systems showing critical stress in sections 9 through 13. The reactor was just the beginning, Du Young explained. The power fluctuations damaged other systems. They need attention too. We should restore the protocols, Voss insisted. Return to perfect logic. And watch more systems fail. Hai-Jin asked. She turned to face the council. Your station is like a living thing. It needs to breathe, to adjust, to find its balance. Perfect logic is trying to force it to be something it's not. The room fell silent. Even the alarm seemed quieter as the aliens considered her words. Show us, Grand Observer Kale said finally. Show us how you try things. Voss stepped forward. Grand Observer, you cannot be serious. This is madness. What is madness? Kale replied. is watching our perfect logic fail while refusing to consider alternatives. Hai-Jin quickly set up a simulation of the environmental systems. On the main screen, everyone could see the struggling life support network. First, we observe, she explained. We look for patterns, like Du-Young did. Then we make an educated guess about what might help. A guess. Several aliens whispered, horrified. Based on knowledge and experience, Du-Young added. Then we try it in a small area first. If it works, we expand it. If it doesn't, we learn from the failure and try something else. Learn from failure. One council member looked like they might faint. But Tren and several other young engineers moved closer, watching with growing interest as Hai-Jin adjusted the simulation. See how the air circulation fights against its programmed patterns, Tren pointed out, just like the reactor did. What if we? They reached for the controls, then hesitated, looking at Kale for permission. The Grand Observer nodded slowly. Proceed. Let us all learn. For the next hour, they tried different approaches in the simulation. Some failed completely. Others showed promise but needed adjustments. The aliens watched in a mixture of horror and fascination as each failure led to new insights. It's like solving a puzzle, one young engineer said excitedly. But instead of knowing the solution first, we discover it. This is dangerous thinking, Voss warned. Today it's environmental systems. Tomorrow, who knows, our entire society could fall into chaos. Or it could grow. Jaiho spoke up from his place near the door. Change doesn't have to mean destruction. It can mean evolution. Before Voss could reply, the environmental alarms grew louder. The simulation showed critical failures spreading to new sections. We're out of time for debate, Hai-Jin said. We need to act now. Who's willing to try? One by one, young engineers stepped forward. Even some older aliens moved closer, their fear of change slowly giving way to desperate hope. But Voss and his supporters turned away, horror clear in their silver eyes. The station wasn't the only thing about to undergo a major change. Their entire society stood on the brink of transformation. And not everyone was ready to embrace it. The environmental system crisis spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, half the station's sections reported air quality problems. The perfect atmosphere that the logical ones had maintained for decades was falling apart. We need everyone's help, Hai-Jin announced to the packed control room. Every engineer, every technician. We have to try different solutions in different sections at once. The aliens looked at each other nervously. Working without perfect calculations went against everything they believed in. This is our home, Tren added, standing beside Hai-Jin. And sometimes saving your home means trying new things. Do-Young projected a station map onto the main screen. We've divided the station into test zones. Each team will try slightly different approaches. We'll see what works best. This is insanity, Voss protested from the back of the room. You're asking us to experiment with our own life support. The old way isn't working, Grand Observer Kale said firmly. We must adapt or evacuate. The word evacuate sent a shock through the room. Leaving the station would mean admitting that perfect logic had failed completely. I'll help, a senior engineer stepped forward, surprising everyone. I've watched these systems for 30 years. Maybe it's time to trust my experience instead of just the calculations. More engineers came forward, forming into teams. Hai-Jin, Du-Young, and Tren quickly explained the basic principles of trial and error. Don't be afraid to fail, Hai-Jin told them. Each failure teaches us something new. But what if we make things worse? Someone asked. That's why we try small changes first, Du-Young explained. And we always have backup plans. The teams spread out across the station. In Section 9, they tried adjusting air pressure gradually. In Section 10, they modified temperature controls. Section 11's team experimented with humidity levels. Voss and his supporters watched from the control room, their horror growing as they saw their perfect systems being changed through trial and error. "They're destroying everything we built," Voss muttered. But the results were hard to ignore. Section 9's air quality improved by 15%. Section 11 reported better circulation than they'd had in months. Section 10's first attempt failed completely. "It's not working," the team reported, panic in their voices. "The temperature is still rising." "Good," Hai-Jin said, surprising them. "Now we know what doesn't work. Try something else." The aliens on Team 10 looked at each other, then slowly nodded. They had failed, but the station hadn't collapsed. They could try again. Their second attempt worked better than anyone expected. Hour by hour, more aliens began to understand. They started suggesting their own ideas, making their own observations. The younger ones showed particular talent for creative solutions. "Look at this pattern," Tren called out, pointing to their screen. "The air circulation works better when we let it flow naturally, like wind on a planet." The older engineers were slower to change, but even they couldn't deny the results. Systems that had been failing under perfect control began to stabilize when given room to find their natural balance. "It's like watching children learn to walk," Jaho observed. "They fall down, but each time they get back up, they're stronger." In the center of the control room, Grand Observer Kale watched the progress with mixed emotions. Centuries of perfect logical tradition were changing before their eyes. But their station was coming back to life. "Perhaps," they said quietly, "perfect logic was limiting us. Perhaps we needed to learn how to fall before we could truly fly." But not everyone was ready to embrace the new way. Voss and a small group of supporters had disappeared from the control room. Du Young's datapad showed unauthorized access attempts in several systems. "They're trying to restore the old protocols," he warned Hai-Jin. "Fear makes people do desperate things," she replied. "We need to show them that change doesn't mean destruction." Just then, the main computer announced, "Environmental systems stabilizing in sections 9 through 12. Air quality improving. New parameters accepted." The aliens in the control room looked at each other in amazement. They had done it. They had solved a problem through trial and error, through imperfect human methods. And somehow, the universe hadn't collapsed. "What do we try next?" Tren asked eagerly. But before anyone could answer, all the lights went out. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow through the station. In their light, the aliens' silver eyes seemed to glow like stars. "Main power grid offline," the computer announced. "Backup systems engage. Warning, unauthorized access detected in primary control center." "Voss," Hai-Jin said. "He's trying to force the station back to perfect control." Do Young checked his datapad, now running on battery power. "He's locked himself in the primary control center. He's attempting to reload all the original protocols at once." "That would kill us all," Tren said, their voice shaking. "The systems can't handle that kind of rigid control anymore. They've started to adapt to the new way." Grand Observer Kale straightened to their full height. "We must stop him. Not through perfect calculation, but through whatever means necessary." The aliens in the control room looked at each other. Just days ago, such words would have been unthinkable from their leader. "I have an idea," one of the young engineers said. "But it's not perfect. It might not work." "Tell us anyway," Hai-Jin encouraged. As the young engineer explained their plan, Hai-Jin saw the change in the aliens around her. They were listening, considering, suggesting improvements, all without demanding perfect calculations first. "We'll need to split into teams," Du Young said. "Some of us create a distraction. Others work on bypassing the control room locks. I know a maintenance tunnel that leads to the control center," another alien offered. "It's not in the official plans. I found it by accident once." "By accident?" An older engineer looked shocked. "And you never reported this imperfection." "I kept it secret. Sometimes unofficial paths can be useful." Hai-Jin smiled. The aliens were learning faster than she'd expected. They put their plan into action. One team, led by Tren, began making loud repairs near the control center. drawing attention. Another group, including several young engineers, crawled through the maintenance tunnel. Do Young worked with the remaining engineers to prevent Voss from accessing critical systems. It wasn't perfect work. They had to guess which systems he might target next, trying to stay one step ahead. In the red emergency lighting, it looked like a scene from a nightmare, but Hai-Jin noticed something strange. The aliens weren't afraid anymore. They were excited, energized by the challenge of solving problems in new ways. "He's starting the protocol reload," Do Young shouted. Warning lights flashed across his pad. Systems are resisting, but they can't hold out long. Now, Hai-Jin called through her communicator. The maintenance team burst into the control center through a hidden panel. At the same time, Tren's team forced the main door. Voss found himself surrounded. "Stop this madness," he pleaded. "Can't you see? Without perfect logic, we're no better than humans." Jeho stepped forward. "Is that really so terrible? To try, to fail, to learn, to grow. Our society is built on perfect logic," Voss insisted. "Without it, we have nothing." "Look around you," Kale said quietly. "Look at what our people have accomplished today. We solved problems that perfect logic couldn't touch. We learned to trust our experience, our intuition. And we're still ourselves," Tren added. "We haven't lost our logic. We've added to it, made it stronger." Voss looked at the faces around him. Young engineers proud of their imperfect solutions, older aliens beginning to understand new ways of thinking. Even his own supporters seemed less certain now. "The protocol reload is still running," Du Young warned. "We need to stop it now." Voss stood frozen at the controls. Years of perfect logical training warred with the evidence before him. Then, to everyone's surprise, one of his own supporters stepped forward. "Chief Engineer, perhaps we should try something new." The words seemed to break something in Voss. His shoulders slumped. Slowly, he stepped away from the controls. Hai-Jin and Du Young rushed to stop the reload. The other engineers quickly began restoring power to the station. This time, they didn't wait for perfect calculations. They tried, adjusted, tried again. As the main lights came back on, Hai-Jin saw tears in Voss's eyes. "All my life," he whispered, "I thought perfection was the only way. What are we, if not perfect?" "Better," Kale answered. "We're better than perfect. We're growing." Around the station, systems hummed with new life. They weren't running perfectly, but they were running better than ever before. The horror of imperfection had transformed into something else. The joy of discovery. John walked into the dark room. He could not see anything at first. His eyes slowly adjusted to the low light. In the corner, he saw a shadowy figure hunched over something. "Hello," John called out. His voice sounded small in a large space. The figure didn't move or respond. John took a few careful steps closer. As he approached, he realized it was a man sitting in a chair facing the wall. "Sir, are you all right?" John asked. Still no response. A feeling of unease crept over John. Something wasn't right. He gently placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "Sir." The man's head lolled back. Lifeless eyes stared up at the ceiling. John jumped back in shock. He fumbled for the light switch with shaking hands. Light flooded the room, revealing a grisly scene. The man had been brutally attacked. Blood pooled on the floor. John backed away until he hit the wall. His mind raced. Who had done this? And why was he here? Swallowing hard, John knew he needed to call the police right away. He reached a trembling hand into his pocket for his phone, but his phone wasn't there. John began to panic. He patted all his pockets but came up empty. Where was his phone? He always had it on him. His eyes darted around the room frantically as a chilling realization set in. His phone was missing, and he was trapped in a room with a dead body and an unknown assailant potentially still lurking nearby.